Greetings, Montana leaders. My name is Kirk Miller, and I'm the Executive Director of School Administrators of Montana. And I'm happy to be with you today to introduce a two-part video series that has been created that outlines some wonderful work that's taken place over the past year. The first part of the series is Sir Michael Fullan presenting his change theory and leadership for educators across the state of Montana. That was produced at the SAM Administrators Institute in July of 2014. The second part of the series is SAM's own 21st Century Leadership Institute program, which is a project-based, embedded, technology-driven professional learning that's available to all administrators across the state of Montana. And Tom Unwin does a fine job of describing and getting that program ready to go. I hope that you'll enjoy. This is something we're very proud of, and please let us know what you think.
All right, so you've got 3 change challenges that you've just heard about, your own and 2 others. And think about not just your own, but the other 2 as you think about what are some of the ideas that you already have that might address each other's concerns. What are some that I will introduce systematically in the course of the day. You will need your handout for most of the things we do, so if you would access this, driver's thing is on the top, near the top of page 1 of the handout. I did a paper 4 years ago that a policy group asked me to do, and more or less gave me the title, or we worked out the title together. The title is Choosing the Wrong Drivers for Whole System Reform. And you can download that on my website, or you can probably just Google it, Wrong Drivers, and you'll get it directly. And in it, first of all, the definition of a driver is a policy and associated strategies that is supposed to cause good things to happen. So that's the definition of a driver. Obviously, a wrong driver is such a policy, but it actually doesn't work. It doesn't gain anything. The right driver is those that do. So when we thought about our own work, if you look at the left-hand column, the right drivers column, this is the foundation of our work. Capacity building, that'll become clear, but capacity building is when you invest in the competencies of individuals and increasingly and especially groups, the collectivity, to be more effective at improvement. Collaborative work, teamwork, pedagogy or instruction, whatever word you want to use. And systemness, a bit of an odd concept that's actually quite concrete when we get to it. So we said these right drivers, it's not that the ones on the wrong drivers, it's not that those should never be used. It's just that they should not be used at the front end to try to run the system because they're not effective. The evidence is pretty clear. You may say, well, why do politicians choose wrong drivers when they don't work? And I don't think the explanation is all that complicated. One is because they can. They've got it if they're in power. The second is because they want a quick fix. So they tend to go for things that are a little more superficial. Third is the so-called wrong drivers can be made to sound attractive to the public, position and such. And the fourth, although certainly from what the governor said and not in this state, but the fourth is because some politicians, if you want to take a sinister motivation, is they wouldn't mind if the whole thing went private anyways. That they don't actually, deep in their hearts, believe in the public school system. So nonetheless, this actually gives you a good framework because if you go through that left-hand column, we'll come back onto the concept of professional capital to deal with those. If you integrate those 4 forces that are on the left, you have a real powerhouse, and then you can incorporate accountability, and then you can incorporate individual development, and then you can incorporate digital to accelerate, and then you can, on the systemness strategies question, we'll encounter this because it's the second big key for the leadership, systemness. Systemness is not a complicated concept. It's when you take into account elements of the context that you are in that are slightly or more bigger than your own piece of it. So let me be just really concrete at the school level. When a school moves from being individualistic to becoming collaborative, the following thing happens all the time. Individual teachers stop thinking about my kids in my classroom only and start thinking about our kids across the school. When schools interact within a district, the individual principals become almost as concerned about the success of other schools as their own. They have a commitment slightly bigger than their own narrow part of it. That's all I mean by systemness. Your orientation to take into account the slightly or greater, bigger picture, and to learn from that bigger picture and to contribute to it getting better. That's all I mean by systemness. And we tried also with policies to think of them being more aligned, although the word we use now is coherence, not alignment. Alignment, you kind of can get alignment theoretically, but coherence is what's in people's minds. So fragmented strategies are the opposite of coherence because they're ad hoc and they come and they go and there are too many of them, all of those things. So that's just a frame that we'll come back to. One other frame I want to give you to think about how to move forward systems is what we now call the push-pull dynamic, which is favorable to change. So the push dynamic is that schooling is increasingly boring, traditional schooling is increasingly boring for students. The evidence is very clear. And as one of our principals said, I'll show you a couple of films, but one of the, we were filming, the principal said, well, the teachers were bored too, but they didn't know it until we had the alternative. So think of the push factor as traditional schooling is not all that exciting. And so it's pushing people out psychologically, if not literally. So that's a change force because it says this current system isn't very good or good enough. The pull factor we think of as in two pieces, and this again will show and delve into these. One is the allure of the digital world, not all good. One of the early chapters I had in Stratosphere was called The Dark Side of the Internet. So there's problems. But then the allure is there and it's almost irresistible one way or the other, so we'll try to figure that out. So that's one piece of the pull, that allure. The other is, and it's only recently the second one is happening, is better and better pedagogy. Some really exciting new ways of teaching and learning and the role of the student in that equation, changing the role of the teacher. All of these I want to be specific about that, as these are not just general trends, these are trends that have some specificity to them. So we're saying then the push and the pull factor are combining to make a breakthrough very likely. Push by itself would just be negative, pull by itself wouldn't go very far. You take the two together, they're a solution. So this is how kids start. Pretty happy, and you don't have kindergarten, I guess, but this is how they start when you do. And then they, by grade 9, 2/3 of these children are bored. I mean, this is on the average, but the data are clear, and I'll show you the specific references later. So that this, the degree of boredom is, there's only one thing I can think of that's worse than being bored, and that is having to teach the bored. That's a hard one. Teacher satisfaction, the MetLife survey, and this is again a big picture across the country. You may be better off, but I don't know whether you're better off in terms of the trend. The trend is, from those, the 2012 is the data, is the degree of satisfaction among the teaching profession on the average across the country is plummeted. And it's plummeting, I think, for micro and macro reasons. The micro reasons are the day-to-day boredom and lack of excitement. The macro reasons are the negative punitive accountability that has been taking its toll on the teaching profession. And so that this is a bad equation. And so when I think of the drivers, incidentally, I would say that these drivers have become more and more prominent since No Child Left Behind. So 2001, we've had almost a decade and a half of wrongness in direction. And this is the part we're trying to reverse now. So that brings me to some of the things I want to use. It's not just the principle I'm talking about here, it's about leadership. But I use the principle because that was the focus of the book. But think about leadership. The three keys for maximizing impact are these three. We'll just do the bottom right-hand one first because that's what we're going to deal with first. Leading learning. one key to this, to the role of the principal is to lead learning. What does that mean specifically? It doesn't mean that they do a lot of one-on-one instructional appraisal of teachers only to try to get the change to happen. It means that they figure out, and we districts and others help them figure out, how do I lead learning in this group? Number two, the system player we'll look at briefly is how do I contribute and benefit from the bigger system? The bigger system might be the district, it might be a region, it might be the whole state. And then we'll zero in on the skills, the agent of change skills that that we want to really get. And they're also push and pull skills. So if you want to think of it in advance, think of yourself right now as a leader, because I'll put some telling things before you later, is do you tend to be a pushy leader, which has some advantages and some disadvantages? Do you tend to be a pulley leader? That is, you don't push enough, you're always trying to build consensus, and therefore there's not enough rigor. Or are you neither pushy or pulley, so you're kind of blah, in a change sense. I don't mean it your whole life. In a change sense. So we'll take those apart. And I want to get to the leading learning one first. This will become really clear. I can touch on this. I don't think you have it in this state necessarily, but you'll see when you read the book. I look at the trend. So you take Tennessee, Georgia, New York State, Florida, almost everywhere. That what's being built up in the last few years is people have said, okay, yes, and we see now that the principal is a key leader. And that phrase that Ken Leafwood, one of our colleagues, made popular, the principal is the second most important influence on learning in the school, teacher being the first most. And they said, therefore, instructional leader is called for. So now various systems have built up the instructional leader specificity. So they've got protocols, they go into classes, they appraise, they give, quite a bit of those appraisals are designed to also linking to impact on performance pay for teachers and getting rid of the worst teachers. That's the kind of the mindset behind it. And so what started as a reasonable idea, we should assess what teachers are doing and give them good feedback, turns out to be what I call an odious task in the sense that actually it can't be done. There are not enough hours in the day to do it. And it doesn't really work because teachers are finding it alienating, and it's all piecemeal, one by one change. So that's how I got into this, but you don't have to worry too much about this, more about the solution. The solution then is to increase impact, principals should use their time differently than one-to-one assessment, and instead direct their energies to develop the group. That's the notion. We're going to look at 2 or 3 ways of imagining that. Incidentally, I think of principals involved in, let's say, instructional rounds and those kinds of things. I think of those as necessary, actually, for the professional development of the principal. The individual's pedagogical professional development through that mechanism is the main benefit. In other words, they get to know more and more and more about pedagogy. But then they don't put it to use on a one-to-one basis, they put it to use on how do I develop the group. So that's the notion. The research is somewhat clear too. So if we take human capital, this is basically the personnel policy. It's the human resources element of it. It's how do you attract, hire, retain, and develop good individuals, whatever the roles are. And this is clearly a very important piece of it, but our critique of it is that almost all of the strategies rely on human capital. If you look at policies coming from the state or the federal level, we've got to get better teachers or more effective teachers into the profession. So that what are the incentives to get individuals? We have to give appraisal and feedback. What are the incentives of feedback for individuals? And the bottom line on human capital is that you can produce individuals one at a time until the cows come home, but you'll never change the culture. Drip, 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 drip. You have to focus on the culture itself, and we doubly emphasize this because almost everyone goes for human capital as the single powerful strategy. It is the wrong driver in that sense as a single strategy. Partly why is that? I think that's how economists think. Not to offend all the economists, but some of them. That's how they think. They think about human capital. And it's also easier to think of human capital because it's very concrete. It's individuals, and individuals stand out, as we all know. There's a great teacher, a great principal. But it goes off the track because it's limited to that piece. And so we've identified two other pieces. One is social capital, which is really the quality of the group now, just what you read. It's the quality of the group that keeps coming out in the research that makes the difference. Not the quality of the individuals, quality of the group. And there's a good short study by Carrie Liana that really illustrates this very well. Carrie Liana is a business professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And she's been studying social capital, human capital, and its impact. And she has done several studies like this. I'm thinking of one in New York City, 135 elementary schools, where she measured only three things. She measured human capital, got the resumes of all the staff on the school, and said, okay, what are the qualifications of the staff? Do they tend to be more qualified or less qualified? And then she thought about the school that way. Secondly, she took social capital and measured it like this with questions to teachers, such as the following one to a teacher. To what extent do you and others, teachers in the school, work in a collaborative, focused way to improve the learning of all students in the school? And if a lot of teachers said, yes, that's the way we work here, she said, here's a school with higher social capital. And then thirdly, she measured math achievement over the course of the year from September to June. So just those three variables. You can see where I'm leading with this. What she did find was, yes, individual teachers with high human capital could make a difference. That's good. But she found the most difference was made when the school had high social capital. That's where the biggest differences overall in school-wide achievement occurred. And that she also found that on the average, a teacher with low human capital who happened to be working in a school with high social capital also did better in improvement on math. You can see why that would be the case. It rubs off on the culture of the school. So this is pretty convincing. And the research has been clear for a long time, but we've been putting, one thing about research is they find what's there, they're not actually doing it, they're not developing it. Our work has been to develop social capital inside the school and across the school as the powerhouse of improvement. And then we thought when we got to that point, Andy and I thought, well, what's missing here? Is there anything else that's missing? And we went to decisional capital as a missing piece for the following reason. Social capital by itself isn't good enough. For example, let's say teachers are not there in a given school, are not very effective. I'm not criticizing them excessively, but they're not effective or not highly effective. And they start sharing each other's ineffective practice, unknowingly. You can see why that's not good enough. It's not sharing per se, it's the quality of the sharing. And this took us to decisional capital, which is really the precision that people come to have about being able to make good decisions, individually, but also collectively. It's about data. How do you use data for assessment for improvement? And how does a group use data to make sure that? One of the biggest powerful leverages is when you link good data on individual students, literacy example, to specific responses instructionally for that student. And I'll show you a clip afterwards. So this is a very important part of that kind of equation. So we are working. Our group, Andy's and my team have developed recently an index to measure these three dimensions of capital. It's about 20 items each, and we're just pilot testing it and reducing it to 15 items. And in January, we're going to release it free on our website to use, so that the tool isn't actually the answer to this necessarily, but it can be an accomplishment. So I guess I want to conclude then by saying, within the school, the job of school leadership is to build the professional capital of teachers in these three dimensions. Within the district is to focus on those three dimensions, partly through better vertical two-way relationships between the district and the school, and partly by schools linking to each other, and including in schools that, especially if you have a lot of districts, schools linking to each other across districts, not just within the district. It can, the general strategy is lateral capacity building. Learn from others. And if you will deal with change more and more in the course of the day, but if you want someone to change, if I go back to motion leadership, what you need to do is give them new experiences in relatively non-threatening circumstances with people who are a little bit farther down the line and build their capacity. Non-threatening circumstances. Reduce the fear of change. We'll come back to that. So this is beginning to add up very well in concluding on this. If you look at principal as lead learner, I won't read this slide, you can just see it as it is. But what stands out, I think, as the single memorable thing is Vivian Robinson's finding from her research, the meta-research around the world, where she said, she went to all of this research, analyzed it, and said, there are 4 or 5 factors that stand out here, what the principal does in influencing school-wide achievement, student achievement. And then you'll notice in that what you read, that one of those factors is twice as important in effect size than any of the others. And it's this, the degree to which the principal participates as a learner in working with teachers to move the school forward. Participates as a learner is the key phrase. This means a rookie principal who comes in, or any principal, doesn't participate as a learner, does some of the right things, work on vision, get time for teachers to work, to meet together, enable professional development, but does not himself or herself participate as a learner, then they will actually not get better at their role. 5 years later, if they've done all those right things at the surface, but not participate in a learner, they know very little. 5 times nothing is nothing. So they participate in a learner means you learn. This applies to all roles, of course. Whatever your leadership role, you must position it as, I'm a learner. So think of these 4 statements. Talented schools will improve a weak teacher. Talented schools. Talented teachers will leave a weak school. They don't want to be around a place that doesn't have good leadership or good colleagues, right? So power of the culture of the school. Good collaboration reduces bad variation. It's an odd way of putting it, but think about, the findings actually are pretty consistent in all of the research around the world, including the PISA OECD studies, which they find this, that variations in the quality of teaching within a school often are greater than the variations between schools, but I want to say the variations are both. That is, we have variations in the quality of teachers within schools, and we have variations between schools. And so what does good collaboration do? It reduces bad variation, which is a polite way of saying it reduces ineffective teaching. Why does it reduce that? Because people are collaborating, and they're sorting out and retaining what's working. So they get more focus and more consistency and less bad variation. Good variation, incidentally, is innovation, which is another topic that we're adding on to this. But for the moment, if you can reduce the amount of ineffective teaching by having the school end up being, in the district for that matter, end up being focused on strategies that really work, and this degree of focus and consistency takes hold culturally, that is, by that I mean within the culture of the school, the culture of the district or more, you really get powerful impact. And lastly, this is another way of saying, this isn't about hierarchical strategies. It's about using the hierarchy to increase the lateral part. And so I formulated this one way of thinking about it. The strength and sustainability of an organization is a function of the quality of its lateral relationships. The stronger the lateral relationships, the more sustainability of the group, whether it's the State Department or the district or the school. Because lateral relationships is glue, lateral relationships is multiple people, and that they carry on beyond the leader. So a lot of the successful work has to get to specificity. Otherwise it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. But the problem is, how do you get to specificity with large numbers of people without laying it on, without prescribing it? So that's the problem I want to take up now. And the diagram we did recently, I'm going to start with that. It's at the top of page 18. I'll put it on the screen here. I've taken 2 dimensions, and they're defined at the bottom of that slide. One says explicitness, and by explicitness I mean in relation to an idea, let's say it's Common Core, or it could be any part of instruction, teaching, and learning. I'm thinking of words like specificity, precision, data and evidence, the clarity and the particular explicitness of the idea, let's say. So think of that as it's a goal to get more explicit, it's a good goal. And then I've intersected or interrelated that with what I call change climate, which is non-judgmentalism, a word we use to say the emphasis on development, not judging people, innovation, collaboration, leadership, trust, those things we saw this morning. So we take those two and then go around the quadrants, which I will do with you. If we start at the top left-hand quadrant, it's where you have low explicitness, low specificity, but you have a good change climate. In other words, people are getting along. What that means is that people are getting along, but they're not doing anything. Right? Of value. Of value. So I gave a word for that. Superficiality. So superficiality, a lot of good feelings, but no rigor, no specificity to the solution. If you go to the bottom left-hand one, which is low explicitness, low change climate, this is kind of the history of the teaching profession. Well, behind the classroom door, that there's people leave each other alone. We don't see it so much anymore, but what it means is that good ideas, when they occur, don't get around because the people are isolated. And ineffective teaching, when it occurs, doesn't get corrected very easily because people are isolated. So I gave a word to that as well, inertia. This going on, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And then at the bottom right-hand, it starts to get interesting because some people have said, well, we really do need a degree of specificity. There's knowledge about here about what works, and people should be using what works. And in doing that, if I use an actual example that really illustrates it. In the late 90s in England, Tony Blair and then Michael Barber, who works with us and was his chief strategist then, they launched a big literacy numeracy strategy in England in Tony Blair's first term. And they said, we want to really mobilize the knowledge and improvement in literacy and numeracy across the country in the primary schools. There are 20,000 of them, so big. And they said, we'll use the change knowledge, in a sense, we'll use this. So they did a lot of really hard work. And Michael Barber ended up calling the one part of their strategy, a wonderful phrase, informed prescription. Informed prescription. What it means is, for literacy in this case, is they did their homework, they got informed, and then once they got informed, they said, this is pretty much what we should be doing. So we're going to variations of prescribe it. You should be doing this. This is really necessary to do. And because the system was loose, when they did that, they tightened up the system a little bit, and they got results. And we did the evaluation of it for 5 years, 1998 to 2002. And we said, yeah, the results are coming because the system was too loose, now it's a bit tighter, and it's getting results for that. But we said it's got a short shelf life because there's not a lot of great ownership, not a deep ownership because it's being laid on. So what I've called that problem, now we're at the bottom right-hand corner, and here it is, resistance. Because there was an ownership, that people then, they didn't own it deeply enough, and so once the political pressure was off and other things changed, it waned. So that's, that even when you attempt to get it right, that's a problem. And then clearly where I'm heading is top right-hand corner, which I'll call depth. This is when you have a great change climate and a great idea interacting. And the way I want to define it, because we'd like to keep it to a small number of things, in this case 2 things. If you were to ask me to define an effective change process, I would say it involves 2 things, and here's the full sentence. An effective change process is one that shapes and reshapes good ideas. That's one of the 2 pieces. It shapes and reshapes good ideas. And here's the second half. As it builds capacity and ownership. As it builds capacity and ownership. In other words, the change climate and the ideas are interacting in that sense to produce depth. So this notion of principal as system player, all it really is this slide. This is when people in this room, for example, begin to say, I have a role, but part of my role is to contribute beyond my corner of the patch. And I want to contribute to it to the bigger picture because it will help, and because I can also learn from that. I can learn from that participation. And that I'm going to increase my interaction laterally and vertically to do that. I don't mean you should spend a lot of time, we'll look at the skills in a few minutes. I'll spend a lot of time outside and not time at home, but just the simple things. If I'm a principal of a school, I'm thinking I have a responsibility to contribute to the betterment of other schools and to learn from them, however that plays itself out, or whatever your format. So the system player is important for those two reasons. One is the system will get better if a lot of people are contributing to it. And the second selfish reason is if it does get better, you'll be better off, because it'll be a better context for you to work in. And so we have different parts of that. But I do want to look at the skills a bit. Principal, let's call it leader as a change agent, because it's more than principal, although I took it out this way in the book. So leader as a change agent, what are the skills we're talking about? And it goes back to motion leadership. That ability to move individuals and organizations forward under difficult and challenging circumstances. And I'm going to show you, this goes back, and here's the single word you need to zero in on for the next half hour, let's say. And the single word is motivation. If there was any two things that coincided, it's change and innovation. In other words, your job is to motivate the unmotivated. How do you motivate the unmotivated? So we're going to look at that in a number of different ways. And I'm going to start with a little RSA animation from Dan Pink, the guy who wrote Drive, because he's all about motivation. So I'd like you to listen carefully to this. It's about 10 minutes long. And think of two things. What do you especially agree with in terms of what he says and demonstrates? And secondly, is there anything missing? If you're thinking about motivation, is there anything missing? What do you especially agree with, and is there anything missing?